Welcome back to Idiot Mystic. This is part 4 of my series on David McGowan's Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, the book that keeps making the 1960s feel less like a peace sign and much more like a crime scene, though one with a really good soundtrack. In part 1, we looked at Laurel Canyon from above, military family backgrounds, Lookout Mountain, and the secret film machinery sitting in the same hills that later became famous for hippies, folk rock, and California freedom. In part 2, we went inside the rooms. Vito and the Freaks, Godo Palekas, Kenneth Anger, Bobby Beausoleil, strange performances, and the early social world underneath the official counterculture story. In part 3, we got to Charles Manson. Not just Manson the monster or mugshot, but Manson the failed musician. We talked about Manson getting close to Dennis Wilson, brushing up against Terry Melcher, and Manson trying to enter the exact same music world that was selling rebellion, youth, and spiritual freedom to the rest of America. Now, in part 4, the canyon gets crowded with ghosts. This is where McGowan starts focusing on the death list, the strange number of musicians, actors, scene people, children of powerful families, and counterculture figures who died young, violently, strangely, or in ways that later became part of the mythology of the 60s and 70s. And then we get to Jim Morrison. Jim Morrison is almost too perfect for the story. He becomes one of the great symbols of psychedelic rebellion and shamanic performance, of anti-authoritarian rock and roll, leather pants, poetry, chaos. This myth of a wild man who's looking into the abyss on stage, right out in the open for everyone to see. And then you remember that his father was Admiral George Stephen Morrison, the naval officer connected to the Gulf of Tonkin incident, one of the major events used to escalate the Vietnam War. So the son of the war machine becomes one of the faces of rebellion against the very world that war machine helped create. Obviously, that doesn't automatically prove I'm not insane, I'm just an idiot, so I understand that this doesn't automatically prove a conspiracy. But it is weird, and in this series, weird is usually where I feel like we have to slow down. This episode is about the death list, the Doors, Jim Morrison, psychedelic theater, and the way counterculture turned certain people into symbols that were so powerful that the actual human being almost disappeared. We're not just asking if Jim Morrison was fake. We're wondering what kind of culture produces a rebel out of the house of empire, produces a rebel out of a military house, puts him on stage, turns him into some kind of demigod, and then watches him burn out before anyone can really tell what happened. So let's get into it. Honestly, at this point in the book, it stops feeling like musical history and starts feeling like someone reading names at a memorial service, where half of the deaths have these really stomach-churning footnotes. This is one of McGowan's major moves. He doesn't let the romance of Laurel Canyon remain suspended in the air. He keeps dragging it back to bodies, whether it's dead musicians, dead girlfriends, runaways, or actors, even the children of powerful families. He goes into everything, even goes into dead people found in canyons or hotels or desert rooms, or houses with too much history in the walls. We have to be cautious here because death lists can become manipulative. If you gather enough people from any intensive creative scene, especially one filled with drugs, fame, and money, you usually find tragedy. Rock history is full of early deaths because rock history is full of people rewarded for living in ways that just outright destroy the body. The question isn't simply whether people died, it's whether the density, timing, and proximity of these deaths changes how we understand the scene. McGowan thinks it does. Marina Habe, 17 years old, murdered in 1968 and found near Mulholland Drive. Jane Doe, number 59, an unidentified teenage girl found in Laurel Canyon in 1969, brutally stabbed and left in the brush. Christine Hinton, David Crosby's girlfriend and founder of the Byrds fan club, killed in a car crash. Alan Wilson of Canned Heat, dead in Topanga. Jimi Hendrix in London. Janis Joplin at the Landmark Hotel. Jim Morrison in Paris. Graham Parsons in Joshua Tree. Danny Whitten, Bruce Berry, Clarence White, Christina Fracca, Gary Hinman, and on until the music starts to sound like something playing over an episode of Law and Order or those weird TikTok crime reels. These deaths are not all the same kind of death. Some were murders, others were overdoses, there were accidents, suicides or alleged suicides, and some official stories may be exactly right, but some remain strange enough that people keep asking questions. McGowan places them side by side until official explanations begin to feel emotionally insufficient. Now, I know emotional insufficiency is not the same as proof. Some people would say it doesn't even matter, but I think it does. There are also times when refusing to see a pattern is its own kind of blindness. Jane Doe number 59 should haunt this episode as much as Morrison, maybe more. Morrison had every opportunity to become myth. Jane Doe number 59 didn't even get to keep her name. That contrast tells us something about the culture's moral attention span. We really do mourn beautifully when the dead person can be turned into a poster, but we struggle to mourn when the dead person interrupts the poster, if that makes sense. The famous deaths are romanticized through the mythology of the 27 Club. Brian Jones, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Alan Wilson, and later names like Kurt Cobain and Amy Winehouse. That mythology is really seductive because it turns waste into destiny. It gives this cosmic shape to addiction and loneliness and just bad luck. But a lot of the time, destiny is what we call suffering when we don't want to examine exactly what's causing it. A 27-year-old alcoholic poet dying in a bathtub or hotel room is not automatically a mystical event. Sometimes it's just a failure of care. Sometimes it's the body collecting debts the culture encouraged the person to ignore. And other times it's just the predictable result of rewarding self-destruction until the self is destroyed. Jim Morrison's death becomes almost unbearably symbolic because of his father. The day Morrison reportedly died, his father was connected to a military ceremony involving the USS Bonhomme Richard, associated with the Vietnam-era war machine. Whether you look at that timing as meaningful or just creepy, the image does have force. The father of command and the son of rock death, occupying literally the same historical day. Graham Parsons' death and post-mortem burning in the desert reveal another form of rock mythology. His corpse was stolen from LAX, driven to Joshua Tree, doused with gasoline, and set on fire by friends who claimed they were honoring his wishes. Now, whether it was loyalty, drunken stupidity, or ritual, it did turn the body into a legend. The dead artist became part of the brand. The culture started considering these deaths just the natural price of the dream. It built and celebrated a life that made these outcomes more likely, and then turned the bodies into mythology. I don't think the death list needs a single mastermind to be an indictment. It just needs us to ask why so much peace and beauty stood right next to so much self-destruction and decay. I think the Doors are a natural place to go after the death list because Jim Morrison feels like the entire Laurel Canyon argument just condensed into one impossible person. The son of a high-ranking Navy officer becomes the leather-clad shaman of the anti-war generation. A clean-cut, military family film student becomes the Lizard King. A young man with almost no traditional musical background appears as one of the defining symbols of rock rebellion. If you tell the official version, I think it's genius. But if you tell McGowan's version, it's super suspicious. And I guess if we're trying to be honest, maybe it's a bit of both of them. Morrison's appeal is difficult to explain through the music alone, at least for me. He wasn't a traditional singer in the polished sense at all. He was not a virtuoso. His power seems to have been theatrical, sexual, literary, and pretty ritualistic. He looked like a Greek statue with alcohol poisoning, and I mean, that's how people reacted. I think that's why the word shaman attached itself to him so easily. He was enacting something, not just performing songs. The audience was watching a young man flirt with possession, self-destruction, sensuality, and the possibility that ordinary identity could actually be broken open on stage. McGowan asks where that came from. Morrison was a film student, a reader, and a writer of poetry. By most accounts, he had not spent years grinding through bands. He couldn't play an instrument or write music conventionally. Yet the early Doors material is just there and ready. Maybe the mythology credits Morrison too much and the band shaped poems into songs. Maybe the origin story was polished until the collaborative mess became just invisible. But I think the suddenness is part of the mystery. The famous beach meeting between Morrison and Ray Manzarek also carries this mythic weight. The ocean, the song, the doors of perception opening. McGowan is really skeptical because both men had attended UCLA Film School, making a campus connection much more ordinary and believable than a mystical seaside encounter. The beat story does make for better mythology because it makes the band seem born from fate rather than media training. It seems like Morrison understood image as well as drama. He understood that a body on stage could become a screen for the audience's fantasies and projections. He wasn't just becoming a rock star. He performed it so completely that it basically swallowed him as a person. I don't even know if he existed anymore. You could say the band's name tells the whole problem. The Doors points to Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception, drawn from Blake's line about cleansing perception and seeing infinity. I think that's a beautiful idea, but opening the doors of perception is not the same as knowing what to do once the doors are open. I mean, that's a lesson I've learned the hardest way possible, but I guess we can talk about that another day. A person can expand perception and still lack wisdom, and you can break ordinary consciousness and still remain completely trapped in your ego or addiction or even some kind of performance for a phantom audience. The Doors made opening the door sound so exciting, but they also made it sound like you might not come back. Morrison's rebellion was existential more than political, from my perspective and McGowan's. He destabilized the young, emotionally, aesthetically, and maybe spiritually, but he didn't really point them toward disciplined collective action. A Doors concert was like a controlled riot with poetry, not a strategy meeting. The audiences were screaming, the police were panicking, newspapers were complaining, and the myth kept growing as the war raged on. Again, I don't think this makes Morrison fake, but it does complicate his cultural function. He gave people the feeling of rupture, but again, rupture is not the same thing as liberation. By the end of his life, Morrison seems to have grown tired of the role. The lean Dionysian sex symbol became heavier, bearded, withdrawn, and more interested in poetry than performance. Maybe Jim Morrison didn't want to be Jim Morrison anymore. I think that's a terrifying problem when the world has already decided that your mask is more valuable than your face. Death did preserve the mask. If Morrison was alive, he might have aged, recovered, embarrassed himself a few times, tried new things, maybe even become better, or worse. But death completely froze him. Celebrity culture loves early deaths because the star can no longer contradict the poster. I'm not suggesting Morrison be treated as a sacred map, but he is a warning that's just wrapped in a lot of beautiful art and words. He opened doors, including many for me, but he didn't show us how to live after opening them. So I guess that's where I want to leave episode 4. I think Jim Morrison is one of the strangest figures in this whole story because it's almost impossible to flatten him. If you try to turn him into a total fraud, it definitely doesn't work. The charisma, performances, and writing, even when it was ridiculous, was real and reaching for something. At least, as someone who's always admired his work, it seems like there was a genuine hunger in him for understanding myth, death, language, gnosis, and I guess whatever we really are. And I suppose whatever lives underneath ordinary consciousness. But I think if you try to tell the clean official story, that doesn't work either, because his background is too strange. The Admiral's son just happened to become the psychedelic rebel. The child of military authority becomes the actual face of anti-authoritarian chaos. The music tells people to break through to the other side, while the family history points directly back into the American Empire. And then, like so many people in this story, he dies young and becomes more useful as a myth than he ever was in person. That is one of the darker themes and weird scenes inside the canyon. The people are real, but the culture turns them into symbols. I think once that happens, you can sell the symbol forever. You can sell the rebellion, the madness, leather pants, whatever you want, the poster on the dorm room wall. The human being is gone, but the image survives. And maybe that is part of why the death list feels so unsettling to me. It's not only that people died, obviously people die, and scenes can get messy. Drugs, trauma, bad friends, and unstable people can ruin lives without needing a master plan. But when the exact same scene keeps producing dead icons, broken families, and strange connections, you start to wonder what exactly the machine is feeding on. Maybe it doesn't need to create every tragedy. Maybe, as crazy as this sounds, it just knows how to harvest them. In the next episode, we move from the doors into the machinery of the music itself. The birds, Buffalo Springfield, the monkeys, studio musicians, protest songs, and the uncomfortable question of how much of the authentic 1960s sound was actually manufactured. Because after Jim Morrison, we're not just talking about another person who was built into myth. The next question is going to be about who was building this myth in the first place. Thank you for being here and listening to Idiot Mystic. I think it would probably be good if you subscribed if you're following the series. And I will see you in part 5. Probably before then, because I should probably talk about something else, right? And if you're still listening, I really do hope you're doing well in all ways possible.